What if I told you the biggest mistakes that kill attraction aren't loud, obvious, or cruel, but subtle behaviors that feel reasonable in the moment? Behaviors that feel like effort, like care, like maturity. And yet, slowly, almost invisibly, they drain the emotional charge she once felt for you. Right now, there's a version of you listening to this who's confused. You didn't cheat, you didn't lie, you didn't disrespect her. And yet something shifted, her replies changed, her energy softened. Her presence feels distant, even when she's still there. In a moment, you'll understand why. Because attraction doesn't respond to words the way men think it does. It responds to states, to how you carry yourself when nothing is being said. And most men unknowingly sabotage that state without ever raising their voice or breaking a rule. Let's start here. Imagine the early phase. She leaned in when you spoke. Her eyes stayed just a second longer. Your silences felt comfortable, even magnetic. You didn't chase connection, you created it. Then something changed, not because you stopped caring, but because you started monitoring. This is the first silent mistake. You begin to watch her reactions too closely. You start adjusting your tone mid-sentence. You replay conversations in your head, wondering if you said the right thing. You try to maintain the emotional temperature instead of letting it breathe. And she feels that, not consciously, not as a thought, but as a shift in energy. Female attraction is deeply intuitive. It's not built on logic, it's built on nervous system response. When you move from grounded presence into emotional self-surveillance, your body changes, your voice tightens, your pause is short, your stillness disappears. You're no longer with her, you're performing for her, and performance is exhausting to be around. Here's the part most men don't realize. Trying to not lose her is one of the fastest ways to do exactly that. Because attraction needs spaciousness. It needs emotional oxygen. When you become overly responsive, replying too fast, explaining too much, adjusting yourself to keep her comfortable, you remove the polarity that once made her feel alive around you. And the tragedy is you call this effort. She experiences it as pressure, not pressure like force, pressure like weight. You're suddenly always available, always agreeable, always emotionally present in a way that feels flat. The mystery doesn't vanish because you became distant. It vanishes because you became predictable. And predictability isn't safety. It's emotional boredom disguised as comfort. Now let's go deeper. Another silent mistake men make is replacing leadership with reassurance. Early on, you moved with certainty. You didn't ask where things were going. You didn't seek clarity. You let the connection unfold naturally. But once emotions enter, many men feel the urge to secure the bond. You start checking in, asking how she feels. Looking for verbal confirmation that everything is okay. Again, this feels mature, responsible, emotionally available, but what she feels is something else entirely. She feels like she's being asked to stabilize you. Attraction flips when the emotional roles subtly reverse. When you look to her reactions to regulate your confidence, you're no longer the emotional anchor, you're drifting. And women don't fall for drift, they fall for grounded direction, even when it's quiet, especially when it's quiet. This is why silence, used correctly, is so powerful. Not silence as punishment, not silence as manipulation, but silence as self-containment. When you don't rush to explain yourself, when you don't fill every gap with words, when you let moments stand without emotional commentary, she leans in. Because her nervous system senses something rare, a man who is not afraid of space. But when you fear silence, you talk too much, you justify, you narrate your intentions. An intention, no matter how pure, doesn't create attraction. Presence does. Here's a subtle truth most men never hear. Women don't lose attraction because you stop being kind. They lose attraction when kindness replaces confidence. Kindness without backbone feels hollow. Care without self-respect feels needy. Availability without boundaries feels ungrounded. And you don't notice it happening because it happens in tone, not actions. She still laughs, she still texts, she still shows up. But something in her body has gone quiet. There's a specific moment when attraction begins to slip, and almost no man recognizes it while it's happening. It's not when she argues with you. It's not when she becomes cold. It's not even when she pulls away. It's when she goes quiet in a different way. She's still talking, still responding, but her curiosity softens. Her questions disappear. She stops wondering about you. And most men, sensing this shift, do the exact opposite of what would restore attraction. They try to fix the feeling. This is the second silent mistake. You feel the change, and instead of staying grounded, you lean in emotionally. You bring more clarity, more communication, more reassurance. You explain your intentions. You show her you're serious. You increase emotional availability as if attraction were a fire that needed more fuel. But attraction doesn't die from lack of fuel. It dies from lack of tension. And tension isn't created by drama, it's created by polarity. When you rush to close emotional gaps, you remove the unknown. You collapse the space where desire lives. You make everything explicit, safe, and named. And safety without spark becomes friendship. Here's the paradox that confuses so many men. The more you try to emotionally secure her, the more she begins to emotionally detach. Not because she's cruel, not because she's playing games, but because her nervous system no longer feels the subtle pull that once drew her in. Female desire is responsive, not logical. It responds to how you hold yourself when things are uncertain. When you can remain calm inside ambiguity, you communicate strength without saying a word. But when ambiguity makes you anxious, and you try to resolve it verbally, she feels something she can't articulate, that you need her emotional clarity more than you trust your own center. An attraction cannot survive that imbalance. Now let's talk about another mistake that's even quieter. You stop leading your own life, not dramatically, not obviously, but slowly. You start adjusting your schedule to match hers. You cancel plans more easily. You wait to see when she's free before deciding your own time. Again, this feels considerate, but attraction doesn't grow from accommodation, it grows from direction. When you had momentum, goals, routines, a sense of inner movement, she felt like she was entering your world. There was gravity there, but when your world begins to orbit hers, gravity disappears. You're no longer moving forward, you're circling. And women feel this instinctively. She may never say it, but something in her begins to relax in the wrong way. The alertness fades, the intrigue dissolves. The subtle question of where is this man going is answered too clearly. Nowhere new. And this is where men get confused. They think attraction is about closeness, about bonding, about emotional merging. But healthy attraction is built on two whole people choosing connection, not one person dissolving into the other. When you lose your edge, not by becoming arrogant, but by becoming overly accommodating, you remove the very contrast that made the connection feel alive. Let me say this carefully. Being emotionally available is powerful. Being emotionally dependent is not. One feels solid. The other feels heavy, and heaviness suffocates desire. Another silent mistake men make is reacting instead of responding. When she's off, you mirror it. When she pulls back, you panic. When she tests boundaries, you overcorrect. You're emotionally agile but without stillness. And stillness is what grounds attraction. A man who can remain centered when the emotional weather changes becomes the calm in her nervous system. A man who is emotionally reactive becomes part of the storm, even if the storm is subtle. Even if it looks like caring. This is why so many men hear the same confusing words at the end. You didn't do anything wrong. You're a great guy. I just don't feel it anymore. What she means is the emotional polarity faded, and polarity fades when you abandon your own emotional axis. There's a moment after you sense her drifting when everything inside you wants to act, to clarify, to repair, to prove. This is where attraction doesn't just fade, it collapses. Because the third silent mistake is chasing emotional resolution. You feel the distance, and instead of holding your center, you try to close the loop. You ask where you stand, you want to clear the air. You initiate serious conversations not from confidence but from unease. And unease has a tone. It's subtle, but she hears it. When a man seeks emotional certainty too early, it communicates something deeper than the words themselves. I don't trust myself in uncertainty. And uncertainty is the birthplace of desire. Desire doesn't live in answers, it lives in tension. This is why many men say, I just wanted to communicate like an adult, and still lose her respect. Because communication isn't powerful when it's driven by fear. It's powerful when it's grounded in self-trust. Here, as something most men misunderstand about women and emotional conversations. A woman doesn't feel closer because you talk about feelings. She feels closer because she feels felt. And being felt doesn't come from explaining yourself, it comes from emotional presence. When you sit with her emotions without trying to fix them, justify yourself, or seek reassurance, you create a depth few men can hold. But when you rush toward resolution, you rob the moment of its depth. You turn an emotional experience into a negotiation. And negotiations are not attractive. Now let's talk about another quiet killer, overavailability after intimacy. This one feels especially confusing because it often shows up right after things deepen. You open up, she opens up. The connection feels real. So you lean in harder, you text more, you check in more, you make yourself more accessible. But intimacy doesn't require constant contact. It requires emotional integration. After closeness, both people need space to process what they feel. Space allows desire to settle into the body. It gives meaning to what just happened. When you deny that space by staying constantly present, you interrupt the emotional echo. She doesn't get time to miss you. And missing is essential, not because absence creates manipulation, but because it allows attraction to breathe. A man who knows when to step back after intimacy shows confidence. He shows that closeness didn't destabilize him, that he didn't lose himself in the connection. A man who clings after intimacy communicates the opposite. And again, this isn't about intention, it's about impact. Another silent mistake is explaining your value instead of embodying it. When you sense her pulling away, you might remind her of what you offer, your loyalty, your consistency, your effort. But attraction isn't persuaded, it's felt. The more you list reasons you're a good partner, the more she feels like she has to convince herself. And no one wants to be convinced into desire. Confidence doesn't announce itself, it's sensed. This is why men who are deeply attractive often say less, not more. They let their actions and emotional steadiness speak for them. They don't rush to prove, they allow silence to do the work. And silence, when paired with self-respect, becomes powerful. But silence without grounding becomes withdrawal. And that's not the same thing. Grounded silence is calm. Reactive silence is punishment. Women feel the difference immediately. This is why pulling back only works when it's not a strategy, but a natural return to your own center. They hear that space is attractive. They learn that silence has power, so they pull back, but they pull back wrong. This is the fourth silent mistake, confusing detachment with grounding. Grounded distance feels calm. Detached distance feels cold. When you withdraw emotionally to protect your ego, to regain control, or to provoke a reaction, your energy hardens. Your tone changes. Your presence sharpens. She doesn't feel intrigued. She feels shut out. Women aren't drawn to emotional walls, they're drawn to emotional depth. Depth with boundaries, depth with self-containment. When you disappear without emotional integrity, it triggers confusion instead of desire. And confusion doesn't build attraction, it erodes trust. Here's the distinction most men miss. A grounded man doesn't reduce presence. He refines it. He speaks when there's something real to say. He listens without urgency. He doesn't punish with silence. He simply doesn't overextend. When you pull back from a place of wholeness, she feels the steadiness underneath. When you pull back from insecurity, she feels the absence. And absence without warmth feels like rejection. Another quiet mistake is outsourcing your emotional leadership. You start asking her what she wants more than asking yourself what you're available for. You look to her cues to decide how much to invest, how fast to move, how deep to go. That feels fair. It feels balanced, but attraction isn't built on symmetry, it's built on polarity. Polarity doesn't mean dominance, it means direction. When you lose direction, she feels like she has to carry the emotional weight of the connection. And the moment she feels that, desire begins to shift into responsibility. Responsibility kills romance, not because women don't want responsibility, but because they don't want it there. A man who knows his pace, his standards, his emotional boundaries creates safety without asking for permission. And safety paired with mystery creates attraction. But safety paired with emotional hesitation creates fatigue. Another subtle error is mistaking vulnerability for emotional exposure. Vulnerability is sharing truth without needing a response. Exposure is sharing emotion to be held. Both have a place, but timing matters. When vulnerability comes from self-awareness, it deepens connection. When it comes from a need to be reassured, it reverses polarity. She begins to feel like your emotional anchor. And once that shift happens, attraction struggles to recover. This is why emotional intelligence isn't about being open all the time. It's about knowing what to share, when, and why. A man with emotional intelligence doesn't unload, he reveals. He allows layers to unfold naturally. Now let's talk about something almost no one mentions. The slow death of attraction often happens when a man stops challenging her emotionally. Not arguing, not testing, but challenging in presence. When you stop holding your perspective, when you stop expressing your truth calmly, when you smooth yourself out to avoid friction, she stops feeling the contrast that once engaged her. Friction isn't conflict, it's vitality. A man who never pushes back gently, never holds a boundary, never says this is where I stand, becomes emotionally invisible. And invisibility is the opposite of attraction. They lose it because they become careful. Careful with their words, careful with their reactions, careful not to upset, not to lose, not to misstep. And in that carefulness, something essential disappears, their emotional edge. This is the final silent mistake, abandoning your inner authority in exchange for approval. You start measuring yourself through her responses. Her mood becomes the feedback system. Her engagement becomes the signal that tells you whether you're doing it right. But the moment your confidence depends on her reaction, attraction begins to quietly reverse. Because confidence isn't the absence of doubt, it's the presence of self-trust. A man who trusts himself doesn't need constant alignment. He doesn't rush to correct emotional drift. He doesn't overfunction when connection feels uncertain. He allows things to reveal themselves. That calm allowance, more than charm, more than looks, more than words, is what creates emotional gravity. This is where everything comes together. Attraction survives when you remain rooted in who you are, even as feelings deepen. When you don't collapse into the connection. When you don't disappear from it. When you stand inside it. Presence without pressure. Warmth without chasing. Depth without emotional leakage. Women don't pull away from men who care. They pull away from men who lose themselves while caring. And the men who maintain attraction over time aren't performing masculinity. They're embodied in it. They know when to speak. They know when to pause. They know when to lean in and when to let space do its work. Not because they learn tricks, but because they respect themselves enough to stay centered. If there's one thing to sit with after this, let it be this. Attraction isn't something you hold on to. It's something you allow by staying grounded, honest, and emotionally whole. When you stop trying to keep it alive, it often does something surprising. It breathes on its own. And when it doesn't, you don't break. You remain intact. That's the kind of presence that never really loses its power.